Today is August 4, 2017, and before we begin, as always, we'll ask our Heavenly Family to guide us and bless us. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, Heavenly Family, thank you so much for love and truth. Thank you for being the great educators of the universe and of the world. And thank you for showing us the errors of our own ways and how we've gone so astray from truth and love and goodness. Please help us to see insanity and wickedness and selfishness for what it really is, and awaken our senses to the reality that we can actually do what is right and live according to love. Please help us to have that realization be absolutely practical and experiential, not a mere theory that we deny by our actions while professing it with our tongues. So thank you so very much for sending us this message in order to point us to reality as it is. Please help us to understand it. Help us in this discussion tonight to advance in a knowledge of the truth. Thank you. We ask this B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so in last weekend's studies, we had kind of the floor open, as it were, for questions and answers on any topic related to the message. And we ended up discussing some really good stuff. Like, I'm really, really glad that we got into the discussion that we had. And I mentioned how, if people have further questions on things, they could comment in the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook page or the Facebook group in order to express the fact that they would like another question-answer meeting and that sort of thing, and to list your questions and so on. But we haven't had those questions and expressions of the need for further question and answer sessions at this time. And again, that's open for the future. If ever there comes a time where you're like, oh man, I have some questions to ask, you can just post it there on the Facebook group, and we can end up having a question-answer session. But since we didn't have that this time, and since we have so much to investigate in terms of the community rule, we'll be getting back into that tonight. And it's been a little while now, it seems, since we've really studied the community rule. I mean, not like a long break, but, we studied, last weekend, of course, as I mentioned, we had the questions and answers, and then we had the Temple Scroll study. Before that, or a couple studies, we had a New Moon study. And so I think our past 5 studies have been on other topics. So because of that, it seems like it's been a little while, even though it's only been a few weeks. But in getting back into the community rule, what I want to do is ask you guys some questions about it, and we'll see how far we get into actually studying it this weekend. Obviously we're into a kind of new section of the community rule, and there's more to talk about in regard to that. So we'll see where we go. Okay, so we'll kind of go through our introductory material to the community rule, and keep in mind that sometime in however many months from now, this study will be posted on YouTube, and other people will get to listen to it who are not here live on the study with us. And so I'm going to ask you guys to explain, what the community rule is and that sort of thing. And I think it'll be beneficial for everyone here and for anyone listening later for you guys to explain it in a way that it would be understandable to someone who really has no idea what the community rule is. So I wanted to mention that to keep it in mind. So again, it's open for anyone, but we'll start with that question in its basic sense. What is the community rule?
Okay, the community rule is a unique set of documents that were copied and written in the 1st and 2nd century BC, written by sects named Essenes from Philo and Josephus's historical writings. And they're found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, are ancient manuscripts. They were found near the northern end of the Dead Sea in the years in 1946 and thereabouts. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in a total of about 12 caves, I believe, so far. And they were found near a community called Qumran. Okay, and so the community rule, it describes the organizational structure of the community, its mission, and kind of like a church manual. And I think it's an important document to know because it gives us a better understanding of the community of the Jews and the early followers of Christ.
Hey, so a question that I'd like to ask is, you said it's a set of documents, and you referred to the community rule using plural pronouns several times. So what do you mean by saying that the community rule is a set of documents?
I think I meant to say they're a sectarian document, a unique sectarian document.
Okay. I'm wondering if I misheard you then. I don't know if I did one way or the other. Okay, so just to be clear, as to whether it's a document or documents, would you like to kind of address that issue just in case there's confusion for anyone else?
I think it's a document, not documents as in plural.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so and I'll kind of expand on that issue a little bit, how in the form in which we have it as represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it appears as a document of which there are multiple copies in a sense, but one of the aspects that we are investigating in this kind of stage of our studies is whether it is a singular document or multiple documents that were stitched together. Because in some of the copies of it, there are only some sections of what we have present in the best preserved copy of it. And so that could go a couple of different ways. Either the best preserved copy, known as 1QS, is kind of more of the original form of the document, and it is a singular document, and then the other copies are just excerpts. Or another possibility is that it originally was several separate documents that were then stitched together into a singular document. So that's kind of something that's still in its, for us, it's something we're still investigating, and historians are still investigating that point too. Some lean strongly to one side or another, and at the present time, at least speaking for myself, I'm not sure, which direction it goes. If it was, again, a single document and then excerpts were taken from it, or whether it was originally several independent texts that were then brought together and compiled into a single document. So that's something that we'll have to examine some more. And then kind of the last element that you mentioned there was how the community rule tells us something, at least in some way, about Jesus and his early followers. And so I'm wondering if someone would like to expand on that, and maybe we'll see if anyone else wants to kind of explain that aspect of things, just that we have more people contributing to the explanation. So does anyone want to offer some insight into how the community rule helps us to understand Jesus and his early followers?
Well, I would just say that Jesus and his early followers obviously thought that the teacher of righteousness was an inspired messenger. That's, I guess, more for the Dead Sea Scrolls, not maybe so much about the community rule, but the community rule talks about light and darkness, and the Gospel of John does too in John 12:35-36. Jesus said to them, "The light is with you for a little longer. Walk while you have the light, lest the darkness overtake you." So he talked about light and darkness. And in John's letter, 1 John, he talks about God is light, and him there's no darkness at all. And in the past, before we found the community rule, we had kind of thought that these concepts originated with, John the Baptist and Jesus Christ and the early followers of Christ. But now we're finding that they're really ideas that were initiated by the teacher of righteousness. And so when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, it became obvious that Jesus, thought of the teacher of righteousness as a prophet, because they wouldn't have been promoting those ideas. And those ideas basically were not unique to Jesus or to John, but they were unique to the teacher of righteousness and the Qumran community. So.
Okay, excellent. And I'll ask now, maybe if someone else could explain who the teacher of righteousness is or was.
I don't believe we know that yet, do we?
Well, maybe, I'll put it like this. It's not the type of thing where we either know or we don't know. There will be degrees to which we may know. So there's a lot of questions that we might ask about the teacher of righteousness concerning which we do not have an answer, but there are some questions that we might ask concerning his identity to which we do have an answer. So maybe someone could explain some of the things that we know about the teacher of righteousness.
Okay, so some things that come to my mind are the fact that he was the founder of the community that settled at the site there that we know as Qumran. He was an inspired messenger, and he also, now, I don't remember if this is known or not, but, well, you know what, I'll just wait on that one. I'll ask you about that later, but because I don't want to raise a question if it's not valid. So those are the two things that I want to mention, maybe just to get the ball rolling in case people are kind of still thinking like, what is he really asking?
Sure. Yeah, it's the type of thing that it's like, okay, you don't know who someone is. You hear the phrase teacher of righteousness. Let's say someone has no clue what you're talking about. When did this person live? Where did this person live? What do we know about the person? Those kind of basic points. So those are two very important things. Founder of the community of Jews which settled at Qumran, and then also was considered to be, both by himself and by those who accepted his teachings, an inspired messenger from God. So those are two very important things. Anything else that anyone has to add to that?
He wrote the Thanksgiving hymns.
Excellent. Yeah, if there was going to be a pause for much longer, I was going to ask, do we know of anything that he wrote? So, perfect, yeah. The Thanksgiving hymns is another collection of writings found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Teacher of Righteousness is the author of the Thanksgiving hymns and of several other texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And, there's not a whole lot more that we know about him, or at least not a whole lot more that I know about him. Maybe there are some things. Certain things in the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to indicate that he was at least very possibly a priest, and kind of was exiled from the Jerusalem temple, that sort of thing, and that he was persecuted or hounded by someone known in the Dead Sea Scrolls as the wicked priest. And then there are some other things. Of course, one of the things that Mary already mentioned is that this whole paradigm of truth versus falsehood as represented by light versus darkness is a paradigm which was introduced by the Teacher of Righteousness. So he has been largely influential. In fact, he's kind of you could, in a sense, call him an underrated prophet, because he has had such a large impact on the way that we think, and yet we haven't even known who he is until the 1940s. So it's really kind of an interesting circumstance. So maybe we'll leave it there for now for the Teacher of Righteousness. And then another question that I'll ask in terms of kind of getting into studying the community rule, what are we doing in studying this? Like, what is our goal? What are we trying to do? And what are our methods for doing it? Would anyone like to explain some of that?
It helps us to know what to do in the future, to see if we're called to do certain things that the community says to do.
Okay, so the community rule gives certain instructions on how to go about doing different things, and so part of what we are seeking to do in studying the community rule is to see if those instructions are instructions which we should be following. So that's definitely one thing that we have in mind in doing this.
This may be just piggybacking on what, I don't know if it's Salome or Celia, but what they just said, is that we're, investigating the claims that are made in it to see if they line up with, if they're true, if they line up with the laws of physics and reality, and if they are to line up with the Heavenly Family's idea of righteousness. There's only one idea of righteousness, and that's the true one. So we're just seeing if their claims are true. And if the author is claiming inspiration is another thing. Those two things.
Excellent. Awesome. So yeah, we want to know what the claims are. We want to know if it is true. The end game is to find out whether we are to be living according to it. And so I'll mention a couple other things in relation to this. And again, this is to continue on the whole piggybacking thing. So basically, in the community rule, it talks about how to bring an end to selfishness. And that is our whole goal as branches. And so the mission which we have, aside from the community rule, is actually the same mission outlined in the community rule. And that's quite striking and wonderful. But two people could have the same mission and different ideas as to how to go about accomplishing it. And we want to make sure that, okay, even though they have the right mission, that doesn't automatically mean that we're on the same page. So we need to investigate it to find out what does it put forward as a means for accomplishing this mission, and is that means coherent? Is it correct? Is it in harmony with truth and righteousness? Does it work? And in doing this, we want to know, does this claim to be a product of divine inspiration? Does it claim the teacher of righteousness as its author or as one of its authors? Does it have a single author, multiple authors? What is the reality of that circumstance? And if it does claim to be a product of inspiration, as you said, Mary, we want to find out if those claims are true, if they are in harmony with physical reality. And if so, then we want to carry this out for the sake of truth and righteousness and the end of falsehood and so on. And, those are kind of the big goals in mind. And in understanding its claims, we want to be careful to study it in such a way that will lead us to understand what the author or authors of the community rule intended to put across. In other words, we do not want to misinterpret the community rule and then judge it according to our misinterpretation of its claims. And so for that, we want to study it within its historical context, within the context of the language, the place, the time, everything that goes along with that. And so that's kind of one of the first steps. And this leads us to the next element that I want to ask you guys about. When we're dealing with ancient texts, and we want to study them in order to find out what they really have to say, we are often faced with having multiple copies of the text that do not agree in every respect. In other words, the wording may be different in one copy versus another, and maybe one copy will have a lot of content that isn't in another copy. So, for example, there are two, not just copies, but even before I give this example, I want to explain a little bit more. In the ancient world, when texts were transmitted, they were copied by hand and sent to different places, and different people would obtain texts, and scribes would copy them, and they would be passed on to other people. And often the way that texts were transmitted had a geographical aspect to it. So, and that geographical difference in where the manuscripts would be placed would end up in a different form of the copies in one location versus another location. So let's say you have a particular writing that was written originally in, let's say, Jerusalem, and then a copy of it was sent down to Egypt, a copy was sent into India, and a copy was sent into Rome. Well, scribes in Rome would copy it and make certain mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes would be big, sometimes they would be small, but what would happen is that a scribe in Rome, when he copies like a second-generation document, so he's not looking at the original copy, he's looking at a copy of the copy, and he's copying his own copy of the second generation of the transmission of the text. If that second generation has a mistake in it, he will very likely pick up that mistake and carry it into his copy and make mistakes of his own. While the one in India will make mistakes, but they're not going to be the same mistakes as the one in Rome. And the one in Egypt will make mistakes also, but not the same mistakes. And so those three lines of text may develop separately from each other, And then you could end up with a bunch of manuscripts that look the same, a bunch of copies that look, pretty close to each other, still with some differences, but pretty much the same. And let's say they're all from India. And then you could have another line of text that look the same as each other within their own text, but they're different from the ones in India. Like, they're recognizably different, but they're all the same as each other in their basic form. And then the ones in Rome are different from the other two. And what that situation gives us is different textual families. So it's not just a copy, but you have families of a certain tradition. And so for many of the manuscripts or many of the individual documents in the Hebrew Bible, for instance, there are different families. So let's just take Genesis. You have the Masoretic family of texts for the book of Genesis, and then you also have the Septuagint family of texts, and then there's also the Samaritan family of texts, and there are actually more besides that. But those are the three main ones. You have the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint Pentateuch, and the Masoretic Pentateuch. And those are all represented in manuscripts, but it's not like we have one copy that is the Masoretic text, and another copy that is the Septuagint, and another copy that is the Samaritan Pentateuch. No, those are terms that refer to the families. So there's a whole bunch of separate copies that are all part of a certain manuscript tradition that we call the Masoretic text. And then there's a whole other family of copies that forms a tradition that we refer to as the Septuagint, and a whole other family of copies that we call the Samaritan Pentateuch. So that's what we often have with different manuscripts. And we're often faced with, well, what do we do with these differences? And with the community rule, it's not, quite as developed as it is with something like Genesis, because we just have way more copies of Genesis than we do of the community rule. And the copies of Genesis that we have come from many different locations, from many different communities, and so we have separate lines of development. With the community rule, we have 11 or 12 copies, all found in one library, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some are from the majority of the copies are from Cave 4. We have 1 or 2 copies from Cave 5, and then we have 1 copy from Cave 1. So those are different caves in which scrolls were found, and there were copies of the community rule found in 3 caves so far as we know. So they do differ from each other to some extent, and that's something that we have to discover, what those differences mean. But it's not like they form into different families yet, because there wasn't a long textual history. And the copies that we have are within, a couple hundred years of the actual writing of the community rule. So they're a lot closer to its original composition date than our copies of Genesis or Isaiah or many other texts. So I wanted to ask you guys, the term for the sort of thing I'm talking about, and what we need to do in order to deal with the various manuscripts, the various copies of the community rule that we have?
Mary just said textual criticism.
Yes, absolutely. Textual criticism. So textual criticism is the study of very carefully comparing all the various copies of a particular literary composition and comparing them in order to discover the history of the transmission of the text. So you might want to know, there's two readings in this instance. One says foot, another says feet. Which was it originally? Was it originally foot or was it originally feet? That's a good question to ask. And textual criticism wants to find the answer to that question. And also, it can get into further issues like, let's say it was originally foot and someone changed it to feet. Well, why was it changed to feet? Does that tell us something about the scribe or the community within which the scribe operated? And is there some sort of bias or a theology which would prompt that scribe to write feet instead of foot, or whatever? That might seem like a more trivial difference, and some of them really are that trivial. Some are even more trivial, the type of differences that are not even translatable, differences in spelling and things like that. But then you have some things which are actually quite significant differences. So, for example, we have two basic versions of Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah. There is the Masoretic text version of Jeremiah. So there's a whole bunch of texts, a whole bunch of copies of Jeremiah that are part of the Masoretic family of texts. And then you have the Septuagint version of Jeremiah, which is represented by a whole bunch of other copies of Jeremiah that form the Septuagint family. But here's the thing. When you compare those two versions, the Masoretic version is about 20% longer than the Septuagint version. In other words, there is more material, and it's sometimes in a different order in the Masoretic version than in the Septuagint version, and as compared to the Septuagint version. Otherwise put, the Septuagint version is 20% shorter than the Masoretic version. So if the Masoretic version is the original one, the Septuagint version only retains 80% of the original. If, on the other hand, the Septuagint version is more representative of the original, then a fair amount of material was added to the Masoretic version in order to make it what it is. Or perhaps there are other options, and it's more complicated. Perhaps neither of them are really the original. Perhaps there is no quote-unquote original. Perhaps Jeremiah was originally separate documents that were compiled, and some were included in the Septuagint, and more were included in the Masoretic text, and perhaps some of it was written by Jeremiah, some of it wasn't. Those are all questions to investigate. But the point is that sometimes the manuscript differences can be very big. So, this is a question that relates to the whole issue of scripture canon and other things like that. So if someone accepts the book of Jeremiah as scripture, if it's in the canon, as it were, which Jeremiah? Is it the Septuagint Jeremiah or the Masoretic Jeremiah? Christians for centuries based their text on the Septuagint readings. And so they had the shorter version of Jeremiah. But Jews had the longer version of Jeremiah. Now Protestants use the longer version of Jeremiah. But how is the shorter one to be viewed? And for most Christians who use the shorter version, what about all that material that's in the longer version that's not in the shorter version? how should they view that? Should that be considered legitimate scriptural writing, or is that apocryphal additions because it's not in their particular copies of Jeremiah? This last part I'm mentioning just for further understanding into the implications of textual criticism, and to make you guys aware of some of those issues in regard to Jeremiah itself, because obviously Jeremiah is an important text for us to consider and study. But primarily, we have to keep in mind for the purposes of our study tonight, the community rule study, that the issues which textual criticism raises are very relevant for the study of the community rule. The reason why, of course, is because we do have multiple copies, and some of them are quite different from each other. For example, and I know we've talked about this before, but I'll just mention this brief example. In some copies of the community rule, it mentions a group known as the Sons of Zadok. In other copies, it does not mention the Sons of Zadok. In some copies, the community rule starts out with the material that is referred to as 1QS columns 1 to 4 in the primary copy of the community rule, which we have been studying so far because it's the best preserved. Again, it's called 1QS. In some copies, it starts with that material. In other copies, it starts with the parallel to 1QS column 5. So should those first 4 columns be considered part of the community rule? Or are they part of something else that was added to the community rule? Or were they originally something else entirely and there was no community rule, and then they were brought together? That's something to consider. And actually, on this last point, I'll just mention so that this thought is kind of kept on record. At the beginning of column 1, it says that the master is to teach the holy ones to live according to the book of the community rule, or the scroll of the rule of the community, which implies that the rule of the community was in existence when that first part was written. So it wouldn't make sense to say that the community rule did not yet exist and 1QS column 1 was written as an independent document that had nothing to do with the community rule, and then it was all compiled together to make the community rule. No, 1QS column 1 refers to Serakayahad, the rule of the community. So either it is part of the rule of the community and the author is referring to the document which he is writing, or the community rule was a separate document that was written prior to 1QS column 1, and the author was referring to that other document, and then later this column, along with, at least up to column 3, line 15, or up to the end of column 4 even, that those sections were added to what was originally the community rule as some sort of preface or introductory material. So, those are two different possibilities. So, I want to ask now, since I've mentioned it a couple times, would anyone like to explain what 1QS means?
Well, it's cave 1, and then Q is for Qumran, and then S is for the community rule. I forget what the... Sedek, which is the community rule.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, that's basically how the documents are referenced. It's, the number of the cave, Q for Qumran, And then they'll either just have a number, or sometimes they'll have a letter or even a couple letters. So 1QHA is actually a reference to the Thanksgiving hymns. In Hebrew, the Thanksgiving hymns are referred to as Hodayot. And so 1QH is Cave 1 copies of the Thanksgiving hymns, and 1QHA is a particular copy of the Thanksgiving hymns, and it's actually the best preserved copy. And so that's one way to refer to it. But it also has a number associated with it as well, as does the community rule. And I think 1QS, if I'm remembering, I think it's 1Q28. I'd have to double check on that, but I think that that's what it is. Okay, so does anyone have comments or questions concerning what we've been talking about so far?
I had a question, and it was about Jeremiah. I missed that part about you saying, Trent, that is a Protestant canon with the Masoretic or the Septuagint text of Jeremiah?
Basically, the Protestant canon goes with the Masoretic text of Jeremiah and all the other books. And I should specify that, with the Protestant canon, there was no council of Protestants to decide on the canon. It was more fluid to, just become a broad consensus among Protestants that these are the books. And likewise, there has been no official declaration that, it's this particular copy of these books. So it's not like it's an official thing that the Masoretic text version of the quote-unquote Old Testament books is the official Protestant one. But traditionally, Protestants have translated the, again, quote-unquote Old Testament books from the Hebrew manuscripts represented in the Masoretic text rather than going with the Greek Septuagint. However, in recent years, there are plenty of Protestant translations which take into account more than that. So like the NET, the New English Translation, has, I guess you could call it an evangelical Christian bias. And they, for the Old Testament, they do include lots of readings from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they note differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, and it's a little bit more critical than just saying we're going with the Masoretic text. And so many Protestants, especially Protestant scholars, do have a more critical view where they're happy to incorporate all of the textual witnesses to inform our understanding of the text. But still, traditionally, the Masoretic text has been the basis for the Protestant Old Testament, and that is shown also by the fact that the books that are accepted in the Protestant Old Testament are the books contained in the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew Bible, the canon that was accepted by rabbinic Jews. And the Protestants exclude books which are in the Septuagint family, which Protestants call Apocrypha and Catholics refer to as the Deuterocanon. So are there any other questions? Okay, there does not seem to be any further questions. So in our last community rule studies, we talked about the various manuscripts and how they differ from each other, and the dates of the manuscripts that we have. And I had been reading some from a volume which is published by the Princeton Dead Sea Scrolls Project. It's the first volume of their critical edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's called Rule of the Community and Related Documents, and it was edited by James Charlesworth. And again, it's a whole series, but this is the first volume dealing with the community rule. And we read the introduction to the Cave 4 copies from this book, and then we also read a little appendix in this book concerning the paleography of the Cave 4 copies. So I just want to ask, do you guys remember what paleography is?
So study of handwriting, I believe, and ancient writings.
Yes, it is the study of ancient handwriting and the actual form of the letters and so on and so forth. And it is in order to find out something. And so do you guys know what it is trying to discover?
The timing of the writing?
Yes. So paleography helps to determine the date of a particular manuscript. So what paleographers, part of what paleographers do is to look for trends in the development of the writing practices of ancient scribes in order to establish a basic form of the letters and so on in different periods, because the way that certain letters would be written would change over time. And basically, by studying the way that those changes, or by studying those changes, it is able to be determined that, in the first half of the 2nd century BCE, Hebrew writing looked like this. And in the second half, it looked like this. And thus, if you find a text which looks like other texts from that period and has the style of writing which is unique to that period, then you can date the text within a period of years and say this is most likely from this time. As a side note, I'd like to mention that there are ways to date manuscripts that are being discovered now which we have not had in the past. And I just recently found out about this from a talk that James Charlesworth gave earlier this year. It's on YouTube if you guys wanted to watch it. And actually, I could just post it on the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook group. I think it was in this one. Maybe the one I'm thinking of isn't on YouTube. I'll have to go and double check. Anyway, I'll just briefly take a little detour into this in order for you guys to understand what I'm about to refer to. But a scholar and historian by the name of Lee MacDonald, who is the world's foremost expert on the history of the various canons of, quote-unquote, the Bible, has recently come out with a 2-volume set called The Formation of the Biblical Canon, and it's all about the history of the biblical canon. And since publishing that text, he and James Charlesworth, who is another canon expert, have given several talks on the subject of the canon. And at least one of those talks is on YouTube. There's another that is on YouTube, but it's not easily accessible. It's not like if you search for it, you won't find it. It's when you upload a video to YouTube, you can have different settings. You can keep a video private. You can have it public. And so there's some that are public, and then there's another one that is private. But if you go to the website for, I hope I remember this correctly, it's something like the Foundation of Christian Origins and Jewish Studies or something like that. I'm probably not remembering the name correctly, so I'll have to post a link for that too. Anyway, there's a link to it on the resources page of the website. If you go to that website, then you'll get to see the other talk. And definitely I would say that James Charlesworth and Lee McDonald are, doing their part in moving Christians and non-Christians forward in an understanding of canon and the history of the canon. I mean, Lee McDonald is definitely, and like I said, he's the foremost expert on the history of the canon. And so I definitely recommend, if you guys want to become acquainted with that history, to read his writings. And I would recommend his more recent writings on the topic rather than from years ago. Not that his writings from years ago are without value, but he, as anyone should, he has grown in understanding and changed his position on certain historical things. And plus, there's just more historical information that has come out. One thing that I will say, though, is that if you look those videos up and if you watch them in the post that I'll put on Facebook, you'll notice that they both, James Charlesworth and Lee McDonald, have a they accept the notion of a biblical canon, and they promote the Protestant canon. They're both Protestants and that sort of thing, and so that's obviously different from our position, but they definitely have a thorough knowledge of the history. One moment. Okay, so I recommend looking at those videos. Anyways, in one of them, James Charlesworth at the end talked about how now people are developing, and apparently he's part of this, a way to actually date the ink that is on the scrolls. And that is really important because up until now we have not been able to do that. We have only been able to date according to paleography and dating the animal skins upon which the actual compositions, the literary compositions, were written. But the thing is, an animal skin, basically the way that dating an animal skin works has to do with radiocarbon dating, and basically it's just when a living organism is alive, it is breathing in, for animals, breathing. Perhaps that's not the best word for plants, but anyways, we take in carbon, and we have a certain amount of carbon within our bodies, and when an animal dies, it is no longer taking in new carbon, and the carbon-14 within the animal starts to decay since it's a radioactive isotope. And by comparing the ratio of carbon-14 with the isotope into which it decays, you can calculate when it died, because the ratios will be different in a living organism versus a dead organism, and then once the decay is continuing on, basically it will be the ratio will change as time progresses. You'll have less of the radioactive isotope, and you will have more of the isotope into which it decays. And by knowing the rate of the decay, you can back calculate to learn when this animal died. But the thing is, knowing when an animal died does not tell you when a person wrote on its skin. Now, it can tell you likely the general time frame, especially when you have a scribal community who is actively preparing skins and, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the caves, along with scrolls with writing, there were also scrolls without writing, scrolls in preparation to be written. So we know that they were preparing the animal skins and so on. So more than likely, they weren't going to just get an old animal skin from somewhere and write on it. Since they're preparing their own skins, the animal would have died recently when they wrote on the document. So it's still a very valuable and valid way for dating these documents. But if you can date the ink, that's just more precise. It's more exact. That's, ink is only going to last so long before it dries up, and they weren't storing it in plastic, they were storing it in clay vessels, and it's only going to last so long. So if you could date the ink itself, then you know when the document was actually written. So it may just be a very precise way to be able to determine the dates. So that's the little detour, that's the side note. Does anyone have any comments or questions on any of this before we talk about a few other things?
Just wanted to mention that another part of the whole paleography thing would be the cultures, and I'm sure in the region, the geography, even within the same time, because some groups would adhere very strictly to to the teachings of their ancestors, and other groups were a little lackadaisical about how. So you actually had to not only know the era, but you also have to know what group of people were doing the communicating.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely an important thing to mention. You could have, even though there is a temporal aspect to the way people wrote the characters of a certain language, there's also a geographical aspect. And one could, of course, have, you could have, let's say, in Egypt, they're writing Hebrew characters in a certain way, and then in another place they're writing them in a slightly different way, and they're both developing as they go, but it's still slightly different from each other. I mean, that, of course, would naturally happen just because of the distance, and scribes in one location being taught by a teacher who is part of a group of students who is taught by a teacher who is part of a group of students who is taught by another teacher, and so on and so forth. And those would be different teachers and students from the people in another location, and so they would naturally end up having a certain degree of difference in how they would write. So just like languages, there's a temporal, or I'll say just like spoken language. We're already talking about language. But with spoken language, there's a temporal aspect to change, and there's a geographical aspect to change. Here, right now, at the same time, people in Western Canada speak slightly different from people in Eastern Canada, and people, maybe not even slightly, and people in different places in Canada will speak differently from different places in the United States and in England and so on. And then there's even a temporal change where you take the United States and the various locations there, and you backtrack 50 years from now, and there's a way that people spoke, and basically no one speaks like that anymore. I mean, you just listen to radio from 50 years ago, and people were speaking differently. So there is a temporal change along with the geographical change. So both elements are important for spoken language and also for written language as well. Very briefly, I'm going to mention again the dates of the Cave 4 manuscripts according to paleography, and then we should wrap up this meeting since we've been on for almost an hour and 20 minutes. And then we'll continue on tomorrow night, of course. So just summarizing, I'm not going to read these little paragraphs like I did in our last community rule study, but on page 57 of the Rule of the Community and Related Documents, Volume 1 of the Princeton Dead Sea Scroll Project, the critical edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a paleographical dates of the manuscripts appendix written by Frank Moore Cross, one of the, if not the foremost expert on Qumran paleography. And these are the dates that he gives. So there's 4QS manuscript A through J. So I'm just going to say manuscript A and then give the date manuscript B and so on and so forth. So manuscript A is dated to the second half of the 2nd century BCE. Manuscript B is from about 30 to 1 BCE, so the last third of the 1st century BCE. Manuscript C from 100 to 75 BCE. Manuscript D from 30 to 1 BCE. Manuscript E from 50 to 25 BCE. Manuscript F from 30 to 1 BCE. Manuscript G from 50 to 1 BCE. Manuscript H from the first half of the 1st century CE, so the time of Jesus. Manuscript I, 30 to 1 BC, and manuscript J, 50 to 25 BCE. So basically we have the majority of the copies, the majority of the manuscripts from the 1st century before the Common Era. We have one from the first half of the 1st century of the Common Era, and we also have one or two that are from the 2nd century BCE. So that's kind of just to remind you all of the basic time period of the various manuscripts. And as we are looking at the textual differences between manuscripts, we will try to keep their dates in mind, and I'll be able to look it up as we go through studying this to say, oh yes, this manuscript was from this date, because the date of when the manuscript was actually written may very well be important in determining the textual transmission of the form of the text. And again, we're dealing with textual history, the transmission of the text, and we may also be dealing with composition history. How did the text become composed into its current form? So that's something we'll talk about more tomorrow night. So anyway, if there are no other comments or questions, and if there are, like if someone has a small thing to mention or to ask in relation to these things that you would like answered briefly tonight, we can do that. If it's something that might take more time, maybe write it down and we can talk about it tomorrow. So if there's something like that, someone can mention it. And if not, would someone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, we want to thank you once again for a blessed Sabbath day. Thank you for the continual outpouring of truth to us. What a privilege it is to be learning such high education, and help us to all appreciate it and apply all these things in our lives so that we can claim righteousness and help wipe away sin in this world. So be with us, be with all the branch candidates. Help us all to have a good Sabbath tonight and tomorrow. And we wait for more of your blessings and truth. Toda Lehenu B'Shem Simach. Amen.
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 All right. Love you all very much. Lila To.
Shabbat Shalom.